Glitch is the community where you'll build the app of your dreams. And today we're going to be talking to one of our community users, Jer Thorp. Hey, Jer.
Hey.
So you are an Innovator-in-Residence at the Library of Congress.
Yes.
What else do you do?
Well, I have a lot of rotating hats. I mean, they're not actually rotating hats. That would be good if they were. But I teach at a program called ITP, which people may be familiar with at NYU. It's a new media arts master's program. I am a National Geographic Fellow, so that involves all kinds of things. Sometimes with dangerous animals in dangerous places, and I also have an art practice that I've had for a long time, which involves making art that thinks about the boundaries between data and culture.
So Innovator-in-Residence is a very interesting title, especially within an organization like the Library of Congress. What are you doing there?
That's a great question, and I'm not actually sure yet. No, so I guess the residency is a research residency. So it is literally the point of the residency is kind of trying to figure out what I'm going to be doing there. But that time is coming pretty close. So my residency ends in March. So now I'm really trying to think about what the end result of the project will be. But in general, the library asked me to come and work there and kind of think about what is the changing role of a library in the sort of face of our new digital culture. And the question that I'm most interested in is what is the data that a library holds? How can that information be useful not only to rarefied digital humanities scholars, but also to artists and to the general public? And so can we activate that huge amount of data that sits underneath the library? Can we make that a public resource?
Cool. So it seems like the Library of Congress has a lot of data available.
Yeah.
You've built some Glitch apps using it. What data is there?
Well, there's a lot. So the library holds about 165 million items. Not all of those items are cataloged because they're usually because they're kind of strange things. So the largest amount of objects in the library is held by the manuscripts department. So the manuscript, if you or I died, we could donate our kind of papers to the library, and that might include things like journals, but it could also include the contents of your pocket and just weird things. So the manuscripts division is kind of filled with that. But then we have all the books and the maps and so on, which are relatively well cataloged, and about 10% of those are digitized. So if we think about the library's data holdings, we have all the information about the catalog. So you as you or I are a member of the public can download. There's 25 million records. And then there's all that digital information. So there's lots of digitized photographs, tons of digitized maps, there's lots of digitized sound and video. So there's all kinds of things that are available to pretty much anybody, more or less through the website.
The large part of content that I personally consume is digital.
Yeah.
Is the Library of Congress adapting to archiving digital content?
Yeah, and I'll put a big caveat in all this that it's by no means expert in all these things. I've had a chance to kind of purposely spread as widely as I can across the library, so I know a little bit about a lot of little things in the library. But the library has an extensive web archive project, which archives a kind of curated set of websites. So this works very similarly to how the library might collect books. So somebody who's the curator of Serbian studies might recommend that certain books which are important to that particular field be accepted into the collection. That process is called a session. So with a web archive, it's websites. So similar to the library's main function, first of all, it archives all the Congress people's websites. But then it has been archiving for quite a long time now websites that it believes have cultural value. And so a good example of that is a fairly new project to archive webcomics. So there's, I forget the number, somewhere around 50 webcomics that are now being archived by the Library of Congress. And that's kind of a pilot project to understand how this type of material could be collected. Very famously, the Twitter archive has been collected by the Library of Congress up to about now, when they're going to stop collecting it as a whole. So there's sort of just a thinking about how do you archive something like that. But there's also a little bit of a tension between what the library does and maybe what a company like Google does when they're trying to like archive the entirety of the web. That was never the idea of the library. The library's idea is never to just archive everything. The library does not collect every book. It collects books that are supposed to be important to researchers and to culture in general.
I've noticed that you've made a couple of projects using Library of Congress data on Glitch.
Yeah.
How did you discover Glitch?
That's a really good question. I don't really know. I mean, I follow Anil on Twitter, so that could have been where it came from. But I also have a real interest in coding platforms that are more accessible to, particularly to either non-coders or beginner coders. I've been involved in the processing community for a really long time, and a processing tool is a tool that I really love, and sort of new iteration in P5.js is something that I've really been a supporter of. And so I checked it out when it first came out, and I was really intrigued by it. And then when I started at the library, and I mentioned this before, I wanted to be as public as I could with the work that I was doing. So I thought that Glitch offered a really nice platform to A, share the work that I was doing, but to B, make it remixable. And so I was always going to release the thing and do a GitHub repository. But that's only useful to people who know how to use GitHub, who know how to know how to deploy a node server or whatever the case is. So this was a really nice middle ground. And so now I do all three. So it's like I'm sharing the thing. I have a glitch page for the projects, and then I have a GitHub repository so it's sort of anybody along the way. And the work is that I published thus far is like purposefully really sketchy in all kinds of ways. And I've been trying to think less about I'm trying not to be precious about it, and I think that's also a nice thing that Glitch does, being able to like remix things and branch them off and try something, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing about not having to worry about DevOps stuff is being okay with like ephemerality and like being okay with like putting something out there that you might take down because you realize it doesn't work exactly the way you want it to do. But also, I guess, from the standpoint of somebody working as an Innovator-in-Residence, like you want more people to know what is coming out of the Library of Congress. So one of the apps that you made is one that uses I think it's called Library of Names is a project. Do you want to talk about what that app does or what you're doing?
Sure. I mean, so names have always been something in data that I've been attracted to, partly because they read as really human things, so it's hard for us to read a name without imagining who that person is. We kind of our brains just do it, and so it's if I read you another piece. So I'm looking at these 25 million records, which are largely about the books that the library holds. So I'm looking at a record about a book. I could read you the title of a book, and it might do something for you. Like you might be kind of intrigued by it. I could tell you the year it was published. I could tell you the format. I could tell you how many pages it is. I could tell you who the publisher was. All those things are interesting, but they don't do that cognitive spark that a name does. If as soon as I say a name, you're like, oh, I sort of can imagine who that person is. And so I went through those records and extracted all the names out of them, and then looked a little bit about how names changed over time. So the library holds things that go back into the 16th century, and further back than that, and then they have things that were published last year. And so the sort of conceit of that first project was, if I were to randomly pick a group of authors from the 1800s, what would their names be? And if I were to randomly pick an author from now, what would their names be? And what might speaking those names or reading those names teach us about what type of people were writing books back then? That's the first thing. But also, what was the library collecting? Because, of course, the library is making political decisions about what type of material they're collecting. And those decisions are being made by curators who have very specific academic backgrounds. And so you see some of that reflected in the data. And it's a small-scale project, and it was never meant to be a kind of deep analysis of name frequency, but more of an evocative thing.
Cool. So I have your Library of Congress mark names project that we talked about up here. I'm going to remix it so I can edit it. So what's going on here?
Yeah, so this is the list of names that we talked about before. So there's a little bit of text to sort of walk you through the imaginary idea of thinking about what authors in this case from 1775 might look like. And then we see 20 of them listed on the screen. So what's happening in the background is that it's going through all of the names and randomly picking a set of them. So this is like a random sampling. And so the sketch is kind of built in a few parts. There's the HTML page, which shows the actual thing. There's a p5.js sketch, which does some of the logic about fading in the names and showing you the particular names. And then there's the data itself. And if you look in the assets folder, you'll see that there's a couple of files here. So there's the names file, and that's the main one that gives you all the first names. And then there's the totals file, which actually gives you a year-by-year total of all the names so that you can normalize against it. And it's not really important for this particular example, but if you're thinking about ways to use this data, that could be cool too. And then I also have a last names one in here. The last names one I actually have never tried, but I'm sure it works. But if someone's looking for a fun thing to do and switch this thing to last names, it should be pretty easy to do.
Yeah.
But let's go to the sketch.js, and I'll show you something really simple. So I told you before that there are 20 names being shown, but if you want to see many more, we could change this first number at the top, the display num, from 20 to 50. And then once that updates, we should be able to go and see, yeah, there's 50 names. Switch to maybe 1990 or something around there. And so this is the same list from 1990, and we can really see the much broader diversity of names that come in 1990. But still, a lot of names repeating themselves: Peter and Carlos and Victor and so on.
Fourth Mary.
For a fourth Mary.
Oh, that's so interesting. And then like names from people who, I see some like Asian names in there.
Yeah, and you'll see that even more and more as you go further up in the.
Still a lot of Davids.
Yeah, undefined David.
Awesome. So you're using P5 for this, which I see. Let's take a look at package.json. You have a dependency of P5.
Yeah.
You've worked a lot with P5.
Yeah, it's great, and I think P5. The thing that I like the most about it is actually not even the thing itself; it's the community they built around it, and they have this really amazing community, which is, I think Lauren McCarthy, who's run a lot of the development on P5, has really described it as a community that's kind of built on people being nice to each other first and then code afterwards. And so it's a nice, refreshing change from some. If people have maybe tried in the past of getting into an open source community and been turned off by it, this is a really good place to get into it.
It's interesting. It's a sort of a small set of data, and that's just names, but like it could tell like a huge story about history and those political choices, which is really cool.
Yeah, this is sort of it was inspired really in a big way by a project that I and two collaborators, Mark Hansen and Ben Rubin, did at the Museum of Modern Art 5 years ago, I guess. We did a residency there, and as part of that residency, we did a performance with a theater group called the Elevator Repair Service. And one part of our performance was actually a reading of the most popular names for artists in the collection, starting with the most popular and going all the way down. And the first 29 of them are men, and then you get Mary, and then but we sort of staged that as a performance. And one of the things that I realized then, which I was really carrying into this piece, is what I'm trying to encourage the user to do is to read those names. Maybe not read them out loud, but at least sort of hear the voice in your head. And it does transform it into a crowd, and you can see faces. And so that's what I wanted to get people to think about. It's a good critical skill, too. It's like, if you look at a list of authors on a paper or speakers at a panel, like, to be able to sort of close your eyes and imagine what those people look like gives you a chance to be critical about what they might be talking about or where their biases lie, so on and so on.
So what API was used for that? Is there a specific endpoint?
Yeah, so that's not an API. So that the library 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I don't know exactly, did a public release of what are called their MARC records. So MARC is one of those acronyms that's not really exact. It's Machine Readable Cataloging Record. So MARC records. MARC records are a really interesting story, actually. They were developed by one of the first computer programmers. Her name was Henrietta Avram. She went to the library. She was tasked with solving this new problem that they knew they wanted to do, which is how do you put the records of a library in a computer. So before then, they were in card catalogs, and you could still visit the card catalogs in the library. They're huge, like millions and millions of cards. And so she developed this system, MARC, this format MARC, which which allowed for a mechanism and a series of algorithms to digitize all their records. And so that was, I'm going to get the year wrong, I think it was 1959, still being used today, MARC version 21. So the MARC records are available for public download.
What's the file format?
Well, the native file format is this original MARC format, and so it's kind of more or less weird free text code, but they also publish it in XML. So XML is what I'm parsing. So in the background of those glitch experiments, I'm doing the heavy lifting, also using a series of Node apps to parse those into data sets that are sort of digestible. So if you go to any of the glitch experiments that I've done in the assets folder, you'll find those process files. If you want to see how they were processed, you go to my GitHub repository. It's github.com/blprnt/LOC, and you can find all of the code to do the heavy lifting. To process those 25 million records, if we're doing some analysis on them, it can take hours. So not a great thing for just hang out and wait for a few hours, and we'll come up with some data.
Yeah. Does the Library of Congress have plans to maybe create an infrastructure where they do that processing so that developers can access an API at some point?
Yeah, so there is sort of API-like access to the search to library search, which is relatively similar. But when you want to process that many records, an API is never going to be the answer. No one's going to make 25 million API hits. Unless you want to drive whoever you're hitting their API crazy. So bulk downloads are always going to be the solution for that. And I think that's fine. I think sometimes as programmer, I'm guilty of this. I'll build an API when it's like, no, I'll just publish some zip files, and then somebody can download those zip files. But there's a lot of thinking about how the library can be more open to sort of digital humanities work through things like APIs. So there's a really good API that you can use, for example, to access historical newspaper records. They have a massive collection of historical newspaper records that's available. The project name is slipping my mind. And that has an API that you can use really well. And again, like I said, there's kind of an API-like way to access the search. If you want to find out all of this stuff, there's the group that I work with, Library of Congress Labs. If you go to labs.loc.gov, they have a really cool site called LOC for Robots, and it'll give you lots of access to this type of information.
LOC now is Library of Congress, not Lines of Code.
That's right. LOC for LOC. Yeah.
I think a lot about talking about people learning more about artists and coders out in the world, and you're working in the Library of Congress, and you started this podcast.
Yeah.
It's called Artists in the Archive.
That's right.
What do you go over in the podcast?
So the podcast is it's kind of about two things. And one is the people that I'm meeting in the library, and the other is the work that I'm doing to try to understand what I'm going to do. So a typical episode involves a long interview with somebody from the library. So the first two episodes we interviewed Kate Zvard, who's the chief of the National Digital Initiatives there. So she does a lot of these digital projects that we were talking about before. And then in the second episode, I interviewed John Hessler, who's a curator in the Maps department and works on Mesoamerican maps. But he's also a mathematician and a topologist, and there's lots of interesting conversations. And then I've been asking librarians and people who work at a library, like, what are their favorite objects? And I do short interviews with people about those objects. So we had a census from, I think, the late 1700s, although my date may be wrong, from Connecticut, which is an early census of a small community. It's counting things like how many sheep they own and how if they do or do not own a clock. It's a really interesting data-centric look into life in early America. But then we saw a daily journal from a guy named A.Z. Young who ran a club in a bookstore in Greenwich Village in the late 1950s, early 1960s. So it's his notes about Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell and Leonard Cohen, and so there's these kind of little insights. So it's a way for me to balance the work that I'm doing, which really tends to focus on these large data dumps, to these other little pieces of texture that are in the database.
So your residency, you said, is coming to a close soon. what's next for you? Besides more
Yeah.
shops, I hope.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I mean, I'm gonna try to get something magical done at the library, and that's my main focus. And then the big thing that I'm thinking about right now is, along with all that other stuff, is a conference that I helped organize in Minneapolis called IO Festival. And IO, we're releasing tickets on February 1st, and it happens in June, and that's a lot of fun. And I'm just finishing up putting together the speaker list for that. So if you're somebody who's interested in creative coding, it's like the best place in the world to come.
So you've got a lot going on. Where can people find your work online?
Oh man, I have a really dusty website that you're not allowed to go to. I think the best thing is probably to follow me on Twitter, BLPRMT, and I post most of the stuff there. I ran a studio for a number of years that we did a lot of really cool work, and you can find that work at ocr.nyc. And that covers most of the last 6 years of work that I've done, but I promise I am working on a new website. I heard that's what the kids are doing these days.
Yeah, gotta have one.
Yeah.
A website. Awesome, thank you so much.
No problem.
It's been great talking to you, and I'm looking forward to future work. Again, hopefully a lot of them on lunch.
I've got a few things that I'm working on, so.
Awesome, thanks.
Great.